Colin J. Hemer, in his excellent book, The Book of Acts in the Setting of Hellenistic History, has argued that we can date the book of Acts to no later than AD 62. Now, why is that significant, you might ask? Well, whoever wrote the book of Acts also wrote the Gospel according to Luke. We can see, for example, in the prologue, the very first opening lines of these two books, that both of these books are written to a man by the name of Theophilus. And they are written in the same high Attic Greek, High Greek. The rest of it is written in Koine, or Common Greek, but they're written in very Queen's English, so to speak. And they're both written to the same patron. So everyone agrees, whether critic or Christian, that the book of Acts is part 2 of the Gospel according to Luke. What this means is, if we can date the book of Acts to AD 62, this would mean that the Gospel according to Luke precedes the book of Acts. That would mean it's earlier. And the Gospel of Luke comes after the Gospel according to Mark. Everyone agrees that the Gospel according to Mark comes first. It's what's called Markan priority. It comes before Luke. So if we can date the book of Acts, that means that the Gospels, the Synoptic Gospels, date before the book of Acts. Well, what's the evidence that Acts was written before AD 62? Colin J. Hemer points out a number of arguments from conspicuous silences. The book of Acts is completely silent on the catastrophic, world-changing events that happen at the time. Like what? Well, as you can see, first of all, the Jewish war and the destruction of the temple. Between the years of AD 66 to 70, we see that the Roman Empire came in with their legions of soldiers, and they killed about 1.1 million Jews. They sieged the Temple of Jerusalem. They destroyed the temple. I mean, this would be like having an atom bomb right in the middle of Jerusalem. And the book of Acts says nothing about it. So too, we read of Nero's persecution in Tacitus in book 15 of his Annals, where he describes that Nero is going through and collecting Christians to blame the Christians for the fires in Rome, and he's crucifying them. He's covering them with pitch and lighting them on fire. I mean, just horrendous acts of evil and torture. And Luke mentions other persecutions. He has no problem mentioning persecutions, but he doesn't mention Nero's persecution in Rome. So too, he doesn't mention many of the major martyrdoms. Like who? Like Peter, who was crucified in 67 AD. We have very good sources on this. Clement of Rome writes about this in AD 95. 1 Clement chapter 5 mentions Peter's death. Paul was beheaded by Nero in AD 67. James was stoned to death by the Supreme Court in Jerusalem, the Sanhedrin. It was an illegal trial, and he was put to death. So the 3 closest disciples of Jesus, Peter, Paul, James, all of them died between the dates of AD 62 to AD 67, 68. And Luke doesn't mention a word about this. Now, Luke has no problem mentioning martyrdoms. He mentions the martyrdom of Stephen. He mentions the martyrdom in chapter 7 of the book of Acts. James of Zebedee in Acts chapter 12, verse 2. That's in AD 44. So he mentions martyrdoms. And wouldn't it be great for Luke to mention that Peter, the one who had betrayed Christ, goes to his death in courage and in bravery, following Christ, being crucified the way that Jesus was? Wouldn't it be great to show that the one who had killed Christians, Paul, went to his death believing in Christ? Or the skeptic James, who didn't believe in his brother Jesus, half-brother Jesus, that he went to his death? He doesn't mention any of this, even though this would fit so well into the ending of the book of Acts. Just to give you an illustration, this would be like if we were reading a biography about Martin Luther King or JFK. If you were reading a biography that didn't get to their assassinations. Something would be missing, wouldn't it? I mean, what they stood for is what they died for. And if this wasn't mentioned in the biography, that wouldn't just be an oversight on behalf of the biographer. That would be a glaring omission. You might be wondering what they were trying to communicate by not including that. In the case of Luke, he wasn't trying to communicate anything if he was writing before AD 62. Moreover, as we read in the book of Acts, there's theological disputes that wouldn't matter after AD 70. Like what? Well, in Acts 15, there's a big argument and debate in Jerusalem over whether Gentile believers in Jesus needed to be circumcised. Now, you might say to yourself, why is that such a big deal? Well, if you were a grown man in the first century, that would be a very big deal to you, whether or not you had to go under that delicate operation. Well, in the 60s AD, at that point, when that took place, the Council of Jerusalem, that would have been about 49 AD. That would make perfect sense because Jews and Gentiles were both starting to follow Jesus. But after the destruction of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple in AD 70, the Christian church was predominantly Gentile, almost entirely Gentile. And there wouldn't be any need to even mention this in the book of Acts. Now, of course, I'm glad that we have this material today, but writing in a historical backdrop, in a cultural setting where everyone is a Gentile, why would you even include this if you were Luke? So too, Luke repeatedly shows that the Roman Empire is supporting and protecting the Christians. In the book of Acts, Paul's life is saved numerous times by the Roman authorities. Now he's also tortured and stoned and so forth. However, when they take the case to these people, they get a hearing with the government. They can show that Christianity is under the protection of the umbrella of Judaism. This would all go away after AD 70. There would be no protection at that point. And the Romans were just filled with vitriol and hatred toward the Christians. So there's no way, I just have to say it, there's no way Luke would be writing all of this unless he'd be skipping over this, unless he hadn't finished writing until AD 62. If these events had occurred, surely he would have included them in his book, the book of Acts. But this only makes sense in my mind if he had finished writing in AD 62. So, if Acts dates to AD 62 here, this would mean that the gospel according to Luke would need to date somewhere in the late 50s, maybe earlier. Luke is our longest gospel. It's 24 chapters, but has the longest chapters. So this would have taken a long amount of time to write. At least a couple years. So that would put Luke back into the late 50s, perhaps. But Luke was drawing from Mark. Luke, in the opening, in his prologue, says that he's writing from those who had already studied the life of Jesus, and he's drawing from the eyewitness testimony. Surely he's thinking of Mark here. Luke knew Mark. Whenever we see Luke appear in the New Testament, he's alongside of Mark. And he copied 88% of Mark in his gospel. So he draws from Mark, which means that Mark must precede Luke. Some people date Mark somewhere in the 40s. Even critics, even James Crossley says that we could date Mark as early as the late 30s or even the 40s AD. So if Acts is in 62, Luke is in the late 50s, and Mark would be even earlier. I would probably date Mark in the late 40s or the early 50s, somewhere in there.